Elena pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the cold morning air. The mountain village of San Marco was still sleeping, and only the soft glow from her bakery window broke the darkness of the narrow cobblestone street. At 4:30 in the morning she was always the first person awake, just like she had been every day for the past 12 years. Her hands were already stained with flour from the morning's first batch of bread. The familiar ache in her back reminded her that she wasn't getting any younger, but Elena had learned to ignore such things. There was work to do and bills to pay, and no one else was going to do it for her. The smell of fresh bread drifted from her small bakery as she arranged the golden loaves in the front window. Each one was perfectly shaped, with a crispy crust that made a satisfying sound when you tapped it. Elena took pride in her bread, even though pride didn't put extra coins in her purse. She stepped back and looked at her display with tired eyes. 16 loaves today. That was all the flour she could afford this week. The price of everything had gone up again, but people in San Marco didn't have more money to spend. Most of her neighbors were farmers or craftsmen who worked just as hard as she did for just as little. Elena's husband used to help her with the heavy work. Antonio had been strong and cheerful, always making jokes while he kneaded the dough and loaded the big oven. But Antonio had been gone for 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through the mountain villages that terrible winter. Now Elena did everything alone. The bell above her door jingled as she went back inside. The sound always reminded her of better times, when customers came and went all day long, when children pressed their faces to her window and begged their mothers for sweet rolls, when she had to bake twice as much bread just to keep up with demand. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Elena washed the flour from her hands and began preparing for the day. She arranged the small cakes she had made yesterday on a wooden tray, counting them twice to make sure she knew exactly what she had to sell. Every piece of bread, every small pastry mattered when you were living on the thin edge between survival and disaster. The sun was starting to rise now, painting the ancient stone buildings of San Marco in soft gold and pink light. Elena loved this time of morning, when the world felt peaceful and full of possibility. She could pretend for just a few minutes that today might be different, that today might bring enough customers to buy all her bread, that today she might not have to worry about next month's rent. Through her window she could see old Giuseppe setting up his vegetable cart across the street. His tomatoes and onions looked fresher than usual, probably from his small garden behind his house. Maybe, if she sold enough bread today, she could buy some vegetables for soup. It had been a long time since she had eaten anything but bread and cheese. Elena was just thinking about how good fresh tomatoes would taste when she noticed movement outside her window. A small shadow had appeared, pressed against the glass like a dark stain. At first she thought it might be a cat, but then she looked more carefully. It was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, and Elena had never seen anyone look so hungry. His face was pressed right up against her window, and his breath made small clouds on the glass. His clothes were so dirty that she couldn't tell what color they had once been. His hair was matted and tangled, and there were smudges of dirt on his cheeks, but it was his eyes that made Elena's heart clench. They were wide and desperate as they stared at her fresh bread. She had seen that look before in her own mirror, during the hardest months after Antonio's death. It was the look of someone who hadn't eaten in too long, someone who was trying not to give up hope. The boy didn't move when he saw Elena looking at him. He just kept staring at the bread as if he could fill his empty stomach just by looking. His thin fingers were pressed against the window, and Elena could see that his nails were dirty and his hands were shaking slightly. Elena felt something twist in her chest. She knew she should be practical. She knew she couldn't afford to give away bread when she barely had enough money to buy flour. She knew that every loaf she gave away meant less money for rent, for food, for all the things she needed to survive. But she also knew she couldn't walk away from a hungry child without stopping to think about it. Elena went to her display window and picked up one of her best loaves. It was still warm from the oven, and the crust was perfectly golden brown. She could smell the yeast in here, the soft crackling sound that fresh bread makes as it cools. She walked to her front door and opened it. The cold morning air hit her face, but she barely noticed. The boy looked up at her with startled eyes, as if he was ready to run away. Elena could see that he was even thinner than she had thought, and his lips had a bluish tinge from the cold. "Here?" Elena said softly, holding out the warm loaf. "Take this." The boy didn't move at first. He looked at the bread, then at Elena, then back at the bread. Elena could see the war in his expression between desperate hunger and the fear that this might be some kind of trick. "It's okay," Elena said, stepping closer. "You don't have to pay." "Just take it." The boy reached out with trembling hands and took the bread. As soon as his fingers touched the warm crust, tears started running down his dirty cheeks. He held the loaf against his chest like it was made of gold, and Elena could see his whole body shaking. "Grazie," he whispered, his voice so quiet Elena almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." And then, just like that, he was gone. He turned and ran down the narrow street, disappearing into the maze of old buildings and stone steps that made up the heart of San Marco. Elena watched until she couldn't see him anymore, then went back inside her warm bakery. She looked at her display window, now missing one perfect loaf, and did a quick calculation in her head. That bread would have brought her enough money to buy cheese for 3 days, or oil for her lamp, or thread to mend her worn apron, but Elena found she didn't regret it. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the boy's face, the way his eyes had lit up when she handed him the bread. She could still hear his whispered thank you, full of a gratitude so deep it made her throat tight with emotion. Some things, Elena thought as she began preparing for the day's customers, were more important than money. Some things were worth more than careful calculations and practical decisions. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the only thing you could do, even if it made your own life a little harder. She had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness would change everything. That by tomorrow morning her quiet little village would be transformed forever. All Elena knew was that somewhere in San Marco a hungry child was eating warm bread, and that made her feel richer than all the gold in the world. Elena closed her bakery that evening with mixed feelings. She had sold only 8 loaves all day, which meant 8 loaves would go stale by tomorrow. In the old days, she would have sold everything by noon and started baking a second batch. Now she was lucky if she sold half her bread before the sunset. She swept the flour from her floors and wiped down her wooden counters, the same routine she had followed for years. The familiar tasks usually brought her comfort, but tonight something felt different. There was an odd tension in the air, like the feeling you get before a thunderstorm when the birds stop singing and the wind goes quiet. As Elena locked her front door, she noticed old Giuseppe across the street packing up his vegetable cart faster than usual. His movements were quick and nervous, and he kept glancing up and down the street as if he expected something to happen. "Giuseppe," Elena called out, "is everything all right?" The old man looked up, his weathered face creased with worry. "Haven't you heard? There are strangers in the village. People I've never seen before, walking around and asking questions." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. San Marco was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, going back 3 generations. Strangers were rare, and when they did come, it was usually for a specific reason. Traveling merchants, sometimes. Government officials, occasionally. But never mysterious strangers who walked around asking questions. What kind of questions? Elena asked, but Giuseppe was already wheeling his cart away. Shaking his head and muttering under his breath, Elena walked slowly toward her small apartment above the bakery, but she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her. She glanced over her shoulder several times, but saw nothing unusual. Just the same narrow stone streets she had walked her entire life, lined with the same ancient buildings that had stood for hundreds of years, but there was something different about the shadows tonight. They seemed deeper, darker, as if they were hiding secrets. At the corner near the old fountain, Elena saw 2 figures dressed in dark cloaks standing close together, speaking in voices too low to hear. When they noticed Elena approaching, they stopped talking immediately and melted back into the shadows like smoke. Elena's heart began beating faster. In all her years in San Marco, she had never seen people behave so strangely. By the time she reached her door, Elena's hands were shaking as she fumbled with her keys. She climbed the wooden stairs to her small apartment, her footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Once inside, she went straight to her window and looked down at the street below. More shadows were moving now. Dark figures gliding silently between buildings, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Elena counted at least 6 different people, all dressed in similar dark clothing, all moving with the same purposeful, quiet step. They seemed to be going toward the edge of the village, toward the old road that led down the mountain. Elena's neighbor, Rosa, poked her head out of her window across the way. Even in the dim light, Elena could see the fear in her eyes. "Elena," Rosa called out in a loud whisper, "are you seeing this?" "Who are all these people?" "I don't know," Elena whispered back. Giuseppe said they were asking questions. Rosa crossed herself quickly. "My husband went to check on the sheep an hour ago. He saw horses at the bottom of the hill. Many horses. More than he could count in the darkness." Horses, Elena felt her stomach drop. A few strangers asking questions was strange enough, but horses meant these weren't just travelers passing through. Horses meant a group large enough to need mounts, organized enough to travel together, wealthy enough to afford good animals. Elena had lived through enough troubled times to know that large groups of mounted strangers usually meant danger. Raiders, perhaps, or soldiers looking for deserters. Sometimes tax collectors came with armed escorts, but never this many, and never moving so secretly in the darkness. She closed her shutters and lit a single candle, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe there was a simple explanation for all of this. Maybe tomorrow morning everything would be back to normal, and she would laugh at herself for being so frightened. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Elena lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds. Outside her window, the usual night sounds of San Marco were there. The distant bark of a dog, the hoot of an owl in the olive trees, the soft whisper of wind through the stone streets. But underneath those familiar sounds, Elena could hear something else. Footsteps. Many footsteps, moving quietly but steadily through the village. Voices speaking in hushed tones. The soft jingle of metal, like coins or jewelry, but rhythmic. Like people walking in formation, Elena got up several times and peeked through her shutters, but the darkness was too deep to see much. Just shadows moving past her window, always. Heading toward the edge of the village, always moving with that same purposeful quiet dot around midnight. The footsteps stopped. The village fell into a silence deeper than Elena had ever heard before. Even the dogs stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, but the silence was almost worse than the mysterious sounds had been. Elena found herself straining to hear something, anything that would tell her what was happening. The quiet stretched on for hours. Broken only by her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, she must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing Elena knew, she was being awakened by a sound that made her blood run cold. Horses, many horses. And they were getting closer. Elena sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was unmistakable now, the steady rhythm of many horses moving together, their hooves striking the cobblestones in a pattern that spoke of discipline and training. This wasn't a few travelers on the road. This was something much larger. Elena crept to her window and carefully opened one shutter just a crack. What she saw made her gasp out loud. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, and in that gray light, Elena could see shapes moving up the main road toward the village center. Dozens of shapes. No, not dozens. There had to be more than 100 riders approaching San Marco, their horses moving in perfect formation. As they got closer, Elena could see that every single rider was a woman. They sat tall and straight in their saddles, their horses clearly expensive and well-trained. Even in the dim light, Elena could tell these were not ordinary travelers. Their clothing looked fine, their posture spoke of wealth and education, and their horses stepped with the precision of animals that had been bred for nobility. Elena rubbed her eyes, certain she must be dreaming. But when she looked again, the riders were still there, still approaching, their number seeming to grow with every passing moment. More and more horses appeared on the road, until Elena stopped trying to count them. There were hundreds now, filling the narrow street that led to the village square. The sound of their hooves echoed off the stone buildings like thunder. Growing louder and more overwhelming with each step, Elena watched in amazement and terror as the impossible procession entered San Marco. The riders moved with military precision. But there was something else in their bearing, something that looked almost like reverence. As if they were approaching something sacred, they filled the village square completely, horse after horse taking their place in perfect formation. Elena had never seen so many people in San Marco at one time, not even during the harvest festival when people came from all the surrounding villages and they were all looking toward her bakery. Elena's hands trembled as she realized that whatever had brought these mysterious riders to San Marco in the darkness before dawn, whatever had made them travel through the night to reach this small mountain village, it had something to do with her. Elena pressed her face closer to the crack in her shutters, hardly believing what she was seeing. The village square of San Marco, which usually held maybe 30 people on market day, was now completely filled with mounted women. Their horses stood perfectly still, as if they had been trained for ceremonies or parades. In the growing morning light, Elena could see the riders more clearly, and what she saw made her gasp. These weren't ordinary travelers or even wealthy merchants. Every woman sat on a horse that looked like it belonged in a royal stable. The animals were magnificent, sleek, powerful creatures with coats that gleamed even in the dim dawn light. Their saddles and bridles were made of fine leather, polished to a deep shine, with metal fittings that caught the early sunlight like jewels. Elena started counting the riders, but gave up when she reached 50 and realized she had barely looked at one section of the square. There had to be hundreds of them, maybe 300, maybe more. She had never seen so many people gathered in one place in her entire life. What struck Elena most was how quiet they all were. With so many horses and riders packed into the small square, she would have expected noise, horses snorting and shifting, leather creaking, women talking to each other. But the silence was almost complete. The riders sat motionless on their mounts, looking straight ahead with the discipline of soldiers, but these were definitely not soldiers. As the sun climbed higher, Elena could see that every rider was dressed in fine riding clothes, well-tailored jackets, polished boots, and riding gloves that looked like they had never seen rough work. Their hair was perfectly arranged, despite the long ride, and many wore jewelry that sparkled in the morning light. Elena noticed something else that made her heart beat faster. Many of the horses carried packages tied to their saddles. Not travel bags or supplies for a journey, but carefully wrapped bundles that looked like gifts. Some packages were small and tied with ribbons, others were larger and wrapped in fine cloth. A few riders had wooden boxes secured behind their saddles, and Elena could see the corner of what looked like expensive fabric peeking out from under one woman's riding cloak. Why would hundreds of wealthy women ride through the night? To bring gifts to a poor mountain village? Elena's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. San Marco had nothing that could interest people of such obvious wealth and status. They had no famous shrine, no valuable resources, no important political connections. They were just simple farming people trying to make a living from rocky soil and stubborn goats. Elena heard a door creak somewhere below and saw old Giuseppe peer out of his house across the street. His eyes went wide when he saw the assembled riders, and he quickly pulled his head back inside and slammed his door shut. Elena could hear him calling to his wife in a panicked voice. Other villagers were starting to wake up and discover the extraordinary sight in their square. Elena could see shutters opening cautiously all around the square, faces appearing for a moment before disappearing again. She heard Rosa's voice from across the way, high and frightened, talking rapidly to her husband. The village children, braver than their parents, began to gather in doorways and peek around corners. Elena could see little Paolo, the blacksmith's son, staring open-mouthed at the horses from behind his mother's skirts. Even the village dogs seemed overwhelmed by the situation. Instead of barking at the strangers, They slunk around the edges of the square with their tails low. Elena jumped when she heard heavy footsteps on the cobblestones. The village mayor, Lorenzo, was walking across the square toward the riders. Poor Lorenzo looked like he had dressed in a hurry. His shirt was only half tucked into his trousers, and his hair stuck up in all directions. But he was trying to walk with dignity, the way a mayor should when facing in crisis. Elena watched as Lorenzo approached the center of the formation. The riders remained perfectly still, but Elena noticed that their eyes followed his movement. There was something almost ceremonial about the way they watched him, as if this meeting had been planned and they were waiting for him to play his part. At the very center of the formation, on a magnificent black horse that stood taller than all the others, sat a woman who was clearly the leader. She was older than most of the other riders, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant style. Even from her window, Elena could see that this woman carried herself with the authority of someone used to command. Her riding clothes were the finest of all, a deep blue jacket that looked like it cost more than Elena made in a year, and boots so polished they reflected the morning sky. Lorenzo stopped a respectful distance from the black horse and removed his cap. Elena could see his hands shaking as he spoke, though she couldn't hear his words from her window. The silver-haired woman listened without moving, her face calm and serious. Elena strained to hear what they were saying, but their voices were too low and controlled. She could see Lorenzo gesturing around the square, his movements nervous and confused. He kept shrugging his shoulders and shaking his head, clearly as baffled as everyone else about why these wealthy riders had come to San Marco. The conversation went on for several minutes, with Lorenzo looking more and more bewildered. With each exchange, Elena could see the sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Whatever the silver-haired woman was asking him, he clearly didn't have the answers she wanted. Then something happened that made Elena's blood freeze in her veins. The silver-haired woman raised her arm and pointed directly across the square. Lorenzo's head turned to follow her gesture, and Elena realized with a shock that the woman was pointing straight at her bakery. Elena's hands went cold as ice. Lorenzo was nodding now, his expression changing from confusion to something that looked almost like recognition. He was talking more animatedly, gesturing toward Elena's shop and then toward other buildings around the square, but the woman's attention remained focused on Elena's bakery. She sat perfectly still on her magnificent horse, but Elena could feel the weight of her gaze even from across the square. It was as if those eyes could see right through the stone walls and wooden shutters to where Elena crouched in terror by her window. Elena's worst fears were confirmed when Lorenzo began walking directly toward her building. Behind him, the silver-haired woman remained mounted, but several other riders dismounted and followed the mayor. Their movements were precise and purposeful, like people who had planned exactly what they were going to do. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the shutters steady. What could these people possibly want with her? What had she done to attract the attention of hundreds of wealthy women? Was she in trouble with some authority she didn't even know existed? As Lorenzo got closer to her door, Elena could see that his face had gone pale. He kept glancing back at the riders, then forward at her bakery, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening either. Elena thought about the bread she had given to the dirty boy yesterday morning. It seemed like such a small thing, such a simple act of kindness. Could that somehow be connected to this impossible gathering? But how could anyone have known about it? And why would giving bread to a hungry child bring hundreds of mounted women to her village? The questions swirled in Elena's mind as she watched Lorenzo approach her door. In a few moments, she would have to face whatever these mysterious riders wanted from her. She would have to step out of her simple, quiet life and confront something that seemed to belong in a fairy tale or a dream. But as frightened as she was, Elena found herself thinking again about the boy's eyes when she had handed him that warm loaf of bread. Whatever was about to happen, whatever these women wanted, she knew she would make the same choice again. Some things were worth the consequences, even when you had no idea what those consequences might be. Elena heard the knock on her door and felt her legs go weak. The sound echoed through her small apartment like thunder, each rap against the wood making her jump. She knew she had to answer, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Through her shudders, she could see Lorenzo waiting on her doorstep, his face grave and nervous, taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart. Elena smoothed her hair and straightened her simple dress. Her hands were still shaking as she walked down the narrow stairs to her bakery. Each step seemed to take forever, and she could hear her own breathing loud in her ears. When Elena opened the door, Lorenzo's worried face greeted her. Behind him stood 3 of the mounted women, now on foot. The silver-haired leader was there, along with 2 younger women who looked to be around Elena's own age. All 3 wore expressions of quiet dignity, but Elena thought she could see something gentle in their eyes. "Elena," Lorenzo said, his voice tight with anxiety, "these ladies have traveled a very long way to speak with you." Elena's mouth went dry. "To speak with me? But I don't understand. I don't know these people. I've never seen them before in my life." The silver-haired woman stepped forward, and Elena was struck by her presence. Up close, she was even more impressive than she had appeared from the window. Her clothing was finer than anything Elena had ever seen, but more than that, she carried herself with a natural authority that spoke of a lifetime of respect and responsibility. "May we come inside?" the woman asked, and her voice was warm despite its obvious refinement. "What we have to discuss is better said in private." Elena nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and stepped aside to let them enter her small bakery. The 3 women looked around the simple room with genuine interest, not the polite dismissal Elena might have expected from people of such obvious wealth. "My name is Contessa Adriana di Salvatore," the silver-haired woman said as Elena closed the door behind them. "These are my daughters, Isabella and Francesca." Elena felt her knees wobble. A contessa. Real nobility stood in her humble bakery, surrounded by flour sacks and day-old bread. Elena had heard of the great estates in the valleys below, but she had never imagined she would meet someone from that world. "Your ladyship," Elena stammered, attempting an awkward curtsy. "I'm sorry, I don't know the proper way to. I've never met ... Please," the Contessa said gently. "There's no need for formality. May we sit?" Elena hurried to bring chairs from behind her counter, dusting them off nervously even though they were already clean. The 3 women sat gracefully, and Elena perched on the edge of her own chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. "Elena," the Contessa began, "yesterday morning you gave bread to a young boy." Elena's heart stopped. For a moment. "Yes," she whispered, "but I don't understand how you could know about that, or why it would matter to anyone but—" "Tell me about the boy," the Contessa said softly. "What did he look like?" Elena closed her eyes, remembering. He was small, maybe 10 years old, thin, very thin. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His hair was all matted, and there was dirt on his face. She opened her eyes and looked at the Contessa, but his eyes were so sad and hungry. I couldn't just let him stand there staring at my bread. One of the daughters, Isabella, made a soft sound that might have been a stifled sob. Elena looked at her in confusion, noticing for the first time that the woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What did you do?" the Contessa asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I gave him a loaf of bread," Elena said simply. "It was still warm from the oven. He looked at me like he couldn't believe it was real, and then he said thank you and ran away." Elena's voice grew smaller. "I never saw him again. Did I do something wrong?" The Contessa was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see a profound emotion working in her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with feeling. "That boy," she said slowly, "was my grandson, Matteo." Elena's world tilted. The words didn't make sense. "Your grandson?" But he was ... He looked like a beggar, a street child with no family. 3 days ago, the Contessa explained, Matteo had an argument with his father, my son. It was about his studies, his behavior, things that seemed so unimportant now. Matteo is a spirited boy, strong-willed like his grandfather was. In his anger, he ran away from our estate. Elena listened, in growing amazement as the story unfolded. We searched everywhere, Isabella added, her voice breaking slightly. The whole estate, the neighboring farms, the roads for miles in every direction. We had dozens of people looking for him, but it was as if he had vanished. The boy is clever, Francesca continued. He knew all our usual searching places, all the spots where we would expect a child to hide. He had planned his escape well, but he hadn't planned on getting lost. The Contessa took a shaky breath. For 2 days we heard nothing. No sign of him, no word from anyone who had seen him. We began to fear the worst. A child alone on the mountain. Roads with wolves and bears, with ravines and rocky cliffs. Elena felt tears starting in her own eyes as she imagined the family's terror. On the third night, the Contessa continued, Matteo finally came home. He was exhausted, filthy, and half-starved, but he was alive. When we asked where he had been, what had happened to him, he told us about a kind woman in a mountain village, who had given him bread without asking any questions. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. He told you about me? He told us about you, Isabella confirmed. He said you looked at him not with pity or disgust, but with kindness. He said you saw him as a person, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be endured. He said, the Contessa added, her voice growing stronger, that you gave him the bread with the same respect you would show to any paying customer? That you made him feel human again when he had been feeling like a lost animal. Elena shook her head in bewilderment. But I just ... it was just bread? He was hungry. Anyone would have ... No, Francesca said firmly. Not anyone would have. Most people would have been suspicious. They would have asked questions, demanded explanations, maybe even driven him away from their shops. Some people, Isabella added sadly, did turn him away. Matteo told us about shopkeepers who shoot him off their stoops, about people who crossed the street to avoid him when they saw how dirty he was. The Contessa leaned forward in her chair. Elena, you have no idea what your kindness meant to us. For 3 days we lived in agony, not knowing if our child was alive or dead. When he came home and told us about your generosity about the way, you treated him with dignity when he felt he had lost everything. It was like you had given us back our grandson's soul along with feeding his body. Elena felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. Her simple act of giving away 1 loaf of bread had somehow touched the lives of this noble family in ways she never could have imagined. But I still don't understand, Elena said through her tears. Why did you bring so many people? Why did you come here? The Contessa smiled then, the first full smile Elena had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. Because, my dear Elena, we wanted to meet the woman who still believes in treating others with kindness, regardless of how they appear or what they might be able to give back. We wanted to thank the person who saw our grandson not as a dirty beggar, but as a child who needed help. Elena looked out her window at the hundreds of riders still waiting patiently in the square. All of these women, the Contessa explained, following her gaze, are from 7 great estates in the region. They are mothers, grandmothers, daughters, and wives. When we told them Matteo's story, when we told them about your kindness, they all wanted to come. They all wanted to meet the baker who reminded us that simple goodness still exists in the world. Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she had heard. The dirty, hungry boy who had pressed his face to her window was the grandson of a Contessa. The simple act of giving him bread had somehow brought hundreds of noble women to her tiny village. We have come, the Contessa said gently, not just to thank you, but to honor you, and to show our gratitude in a way that we hope will help not just you, but your entire village. Elena wiped the tears from her eyes, but they kept coming. The Contessa's words echoed in her mind, but she still couldn't fully grasp what was happening. Through her bakery window she could see the hundreds of women still mounted on their magnificent horses, all waiting patiently in the morning sun. I don't understand, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. You came all this way just to thank me? But what I did, it was nothing special. It was just what anyone should do when they see a hungry child. The Contessa exchanged a meaningful look with her daughters before standing up from her chair. Elena, that is exactly why we came. Because you think what you did was nothing special, when in truth it was everything. Isabella moved to the window and gestured toward the square. Every woman out there has heard Matteo's story. Every one of them has children or grandchildren of their own. They know what it means to fear for a child's life, and they know what it means to have someone treat that child with kindness when they are vulnerable and afraid. Francesca joined her sister at the window. We didn't come just to say thank you, Elena. We came to do something about it. Elena looked confused. Do something about what? The Contessa smiled again, that warm expression that lit up her whole face. We came to make sure that your kindness creates more kindness. We came to help not just you, but everyone in San Marco, so that this village becomes known as a place where people take care of each other. Before Elena could ask what she meant, the Contessa walked to the door and opened it. She stepped outside and Elena followed nervously, with Isabella and Francesca close behind, the sight that greeted Elena in the village square was unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined. The hundreds of mounted women had arranged themselves in perfect lines, and now Elena could see clearly that every single horse carried packages, bundles, and wooden chests tied to their saddles. The Contessa raised her hand, and immediately every woman dismounted in perfect unison. The sound of hundreds of boots hitting the cobblestones echoed off the stone buildings like distant thunder. Then, as if they had rehearsed this moment for weeks, the women began untying their packages and arranging them in neat piles throughout the square. Elena watched in amazement as the packages were opened to reveal their contents. Sacks of flour, not the rough, cheap flour Elena usually bought, but fine, white flour that looked like it had been ground from the best wheat. Wheels of cheese, golden and fragrant, bigger than any Elena had seen in the village markets. Preserved meats wrapped in clean cloth, bottles of olive oil that gleamed like liquid gold in the morning light, and jars of honey that caught the sunlight like amber jewels. But that was just the beginning. The women brought out bolts of beautiful fabric, wool so soft it looked like clouds, linen white as fresh snow, and silk in colors Elena had only seen in her dreams. There were tools for the village craftsmen, hammers and saws and chisels that shone with newness. There were medicines and herbs, carefully labeled and packaged, enough to stock the village healer for months. Elena's neighbors began creeping out of their houses, drawn by curiosity and amazement. Old Giuseppe emerged first, his eyes wide with wonder as he stared at the bounty being arranged in the square. Rosa appeared in her doorway, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, her mouth hanging open in shock. Children began to gather, no longer hiding behind their parents, but drawn by the sight of so many beautiful horses and mysterious packages. Little Paul, the blacksmith's son, pointed at a magnificent gray stallion and whispered something to his mother that made her smile despite her confusion. The Contessa walked back to Elena, who stood frozen in the doorway of her bakery. "This is for your village?" she said simply. "All of it? I don't understand," Elena repeated. Feeling like those were the only words she could manage, Isabella approached, carrying a beautiful wooden chest. "This is for you specifically, Elena. It contains enough gold coins to ensure you never have to worry about buying flour or paying rent again. But more than that, it contains contracts." "Contracts?" Elena asked weakly. Francesca nodded. "Agreements. From all 7 estates to purchase bread from you regularly. Fresh bread for our workers, our servants, our families. You'll have more orders than you can fill if you want them." The Contessa gestured toward the piles of goods filling the square. "And for your village, we have similar arrangements. Giuseppe's vegetables, the blacksmith's tools, the weaver's cloth, we want to buy from San Marco. We want to create a partnership that will bring prosperity to everyone here." Elena looked around the square, watching her neighbors slowly approach the gifts. The village priest, Father Romano, was examining a box of beautiful candles and religious books. The old weaver Lucia was running her weathered fingers over silk. Fabric that probably cost more than she made in a year, tears streaming down her face. "But why?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "All of this just because I gave bread to a hungry boy?" The Contessa took Elena's hands in her own. "Because that hungry boy was our Matteo? Because you saw past his dirty clothes and matted hair too? The person underneath? Because you gave freely without expecting anything in return? Because in a world where people often ignore suffering they cannot profit from, you chose to act with simple human kindness." One of the younger women approached, leading a small boy by the hand. Elena's heart stopped when she recognized him. It was the same child who had pressed his face to her window, but now he was clean and well-dressed, his hair combed and his face bright with health and happiness. "Matteo," the Contessa said gently, "this is Elena, the kind lady who gave you bread when you needed it most." The boy looked up at Elena with those same eyes she remembered, but now they sparkled with joy instead of desperate hunger. "Thank you," he said in his clear young voice. "You saved my life." Elena knelt down to the boy's level, tears flowing freely now. "You don't need to thank me, little one. I'm just glad you made it home safely to your family." Matteo smiled and threw his arms around Elena's neck in a fierce hug. "Nona says you're an angel," he whispered in her ear. "She says angels sometimes look like regular people, and they help when nobody else will." Elena looked over the boy's shoulder at the bustling square, where her neighbors were discovering treasures beyond their wildest dreams. Giuseppe was examining seeds for vegetables he had never thought to grow. Rosa was holding up a length of fine fabric, tears of joy streaming down her face. The blacksmith was running his hands over tools of a quality he had only heard about in stories, but more than the material gifts, Elena could see something else happening. Her neighbors were talking to the noble women, no longer cowering in fear, but beginning to engage in conversation. She could see respect flowing both ways, the wealthy women treating the simple villagers with genuine interest and courtesy, and the villagers responding with the natural dignity of people who worked hard and lived honest lives. "One act of kindness," the Contessa said, following Elena's gaze, "creates ripples that can change everything. You gave to one child without thinking about reward. Today we give to your entire village without thinking about reward. And tomorrow, who knows how far those ripples will travel." As the day wore on, Elena watched her village transform before her eyes. The packages were distributed with careful attention to each family's needs. The widow with too many children received extra food and warm clothing. The young couple struggling to start their farm were given seeds and tools. The old carpenter whose hands had grown too stiff for fine work received medicine that would ease his pain, but perhaps the most precious gift was the promise of ongoing connection. The noble women didn't just give their gifts and leave. They stayed, sharing meals with the villagers, learning about their lives, their challenges, their dreams. Elena watched as barriers of class and wealth dissolved in the face of genuine human connection. As evening approached and the women finally prepared to leave, the Contessa came to Elena one last time. "We will return," she promised. "Not as strangers bringing charity, but as friends maintaining relationships. San Marco will never be forgotten by the 7 estates. The kindness you showed to one lost child has created bonds that will last for generations." Elena looked around at her transformed village, at neighbors who no longer worried about their next meal, at children playing with new toys, at craftsmen examining tools that would help them create beautiful things. But most of all, she looked at the faces of her fellow villagers, bright with hope and possibility, where once there had been only resignation to hardship. "I still can't believe all this came from giving away one loaf of bread," Elena said. The Contessa squeezed her hand gently. "That's what makes you special, Elena. You'll never fully understand the power of your own kindness. And that's exactly why that kindness is so pure." As the sun set behind the mountains and the last of the riders disappeared down the winding road, Elena stood in her bakery doorway. Looking out at San Marco, her village looked the same on the surface, the same ancient stone buildings, the same narrow streets, the same mountains rising all around them.